So, I'm going to read a little bit of England, A Short History by Goldwin Smith. This book opens a little bit more easily. So, I'm going to use this little pointer thing. It's from my scratch art pad, but I'm going to try to use this. Anglo-Saxons versus Celts. Meanwhile, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes began to row their undecked, mastless longboats from northeastern Europe over the seas to England. Sometimes these warrior pirates were driven away by the guards of the Roman Count of the Saxon shore. Often the marauders were successful in their raids and carried their plunder home. G.M. Trevelyan describes in his essay Social Life in the Roman Britain how these Anglo-Saxons told their tales of the island with its ill-defended houses of rich men, its fat lands fit for deep ploughing, its green pastures for cattle, its oak forests for swine. About 450, the Anglo-Saxons began to move their families across the seas. The various tribes of these tall, long-headed, and fair-haired invaders all mingled together with a common purpose but little unity of command, began to settle in Essex, Kent, Hampshire, and Surrey. They made meandering trackways through the forests, traveled along the river systems, built little villages of wooden huts. Slowly they conquered and held a large part of what is now England. They were no more successful than the Romans in conquering Scotland, the uplands of Wales, Devon, Cornwall, Cumberland, and Somerset. Many Celts were killed as they resisted the advance of the Anglo-Saxons. Others fled to the ancient fortresses of Wales and Cornwall. Some Celts stayed where they were. In Wessex, for instance, there seemed to have been considerable mingling of Celts and Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons lived mostly by hunting and agriculture. They preferred to live in the open fields and woodlands, away from the towns built by the Romans. The Roman villas, the camps deserted by the fleeing Roman legions, all were abandoned. The Roman roads and bridges were allowed to deteriorate. There was only a trickle of trade with Europe. Religion and architecture. The Anglo-Saxons believed in a religion of warfare and destruction, with a paradise of alternate wassail and combat. Some of the days of our week are derived from the names of their nature gods. Wednesday is the day of Woden, god of war. Thursday is the day of Thunor, hammer god of weather. Friday is the day of Frigg, goddess of fertility. The name of Easter comes from the Anglo-Saxon goddess Eostre, who returned in April to greet the spring. Many modern customs, such as the use of holly and the burning log at Christmas, have descended from the Anglo-Saxon Yuletide celebrations. When the old gods succumbed to Christianity, they left in these things, and in fairy tales and legends, the traces of their reign. The literature of the Anglo-Saxons is characterized by a sense of harsh reality and a sense of reverence. Most students of English history have read the heroic and vigorous verse of Widsith, the Phoenix, the Battle of Malden, the Seafarer, and the Wanderer. There were also the early religious poems by unknown authors, such as The Dream of the Road, Genesis, Exodus, and Daniel. One of the famous singers of the 7th century was Caedmon, Northumbrian cowherd, and later a lay brother in the Abbey of Whitby. It may be that Caedmon's hymn, "Now We Must Hymn the Master of Heaven," was the first piece of literature composed on English soil. Beowulf, the oldest English epic, is a series of episodes about when the hero of the people living to the south of the Great Lakes of Sweden. It is the only survivor in a completed form of the many epics known to have existed. Before the 9th century, this long poem was composed from several old lays and chants, sifted through many versions and forms. The earliest manuscript now extant is written in West Saxon and dates from the 10th century. Many generations of men doubtless listened with sympathy and understanding to the minstrel describing the terrors of the sea, or the great dragon of Beowulf, or praising the foremost Anglo-Saxon virtue, which was constant courage. The return of Christianity. After years of conflict among the Anglo-Saxon tribes, there emerged the 7 great kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Wessex, Kent, and Sussex. Into a territory thus divided, there came the unifying force of Christianity. After the Anglo-Saxons came to conquer and live in Britain, Christianity was wiped out except among the Celts in the lands far from the reach of the invaders. These Celtic Christians were at first almost out of touch with the Saxons, with Europe, with Rome. Then slowly communication was established again. One of the men responsible for the change was St. Patrick. St. Patrick, born in Britain, was taken as a youth to Ireland, where he was a slave. He escaped, traveled to Europe, entered a monastery there, and later returned as a missionary to Ireland. For centuries, the Irish had been great scholars. Now they increased. Their missionary work. They founded monasteries in Italy, Switzerland, Wales, Cornwall, and on the island of Iona, off the coast of Scotland. St. Columba, an Irish Scot who founded Iona about 590, converted many heathen Scotsmen and Picts. Thus, along the western fringe of Britain, the Celtic monks and missionaries kept Christianity alive and vigorous. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent his friend Augustine and 40 monks to begin the conversion of Anglo-Saxon England. Ethelbert, King of Kent, was convinced of the honesty of Augustine and gave the Roman missionaries a dwelling place at Canterbury, provided food, and permitted them to preach and teach. Shortly afterwards, Ethelbert accepted Christianity and gave a grant of land to Augustine in Canterbury. Augustine was soon consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury. Slowly Christianity spread into East Anglia and Northumbria. Of importance was the conflict between Roman and Celtic Christianity. On many points, the habits of the Celtic Christians, so long separated from Rome and Europe, differed from the prevailing customs of the Roman Christians. There were Celtic peculiarities of ritual, liturgy, penitential discipline, the organization of ecclesiastical districts, the shape of the tonsure, nor could the Celtic and Roman Christians agree upon the proper method of computing the date of Easter. This was a matter of considerable importance to devout and passionate churchmen. In 664, at the Synod of Whitby, representatives of rival Celtic and Roman missions debated before King Oswy of Northumbria the questions at issue. What was most important was the problem of Christian unity in the British Isles. Would the Celtic Christians turn aside from the Roman Christians of all Europe? To fight against Rome, said a debater at Whitby, is to fight against the world. Oswy decided in favor of the usages of Rome. The cause of the Celtic Christians was lost in England. Therefore, of Theodore of Tarsus, the city of St. Paul, was sent from Rome to organize a new hierarchy, a united English church under the dominion of Canterbury. In 735, an archbishopric of York was established. It was to hold jurisdiction north of the Humber. Through these years, the temporal power of the church increased as more wealth passed into its hands. Anglo-Saxon kings and nobles endowed bishoprics and monasteries with land. The moral force of the church was steadily extended. The churchmen stood in an age of faith as mediators between God and man. They also controlled the means of salvation, the holy sacraments. The learned men of the age were almost all churchmen. They developed schools, often giving their students a training equal to the best in Europe. They built and maintained libraries. They took an active part in government and diplomacy. They promoted the growth of art and architecture, stimulated commerce and agriculture, arts and industrial crafts. They built churches of stone in place of the structures of timber and reeds. The conversion, more truly than the age of the Renaissance, gave Englishmen a new heaven and a new earth. Nobles, freemen, serfs, and slaves. When the Anglo-Saxons came to England, they were roughly divided into nobles, freemen, serfs, and slaves. Movements up and down the scale were easy and frequent. Throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, there occurred considerable changes in the ranks of a society that was not static but fluid. In the early stages of the Anglo-Saxon conquest, the nobility, who were a nobility of blood, were called eorls. These eorls were gradually replaced by a new nobility of service and wealth, called thanes or gesids. Although custom varied in different kingdoms, the nobles usually received large grants of land from the king. They were the military associates of the king and his main household servants. In the later Anglo-Saxon period, any man who obtained sufficient land might become a thane. The highest offices in church and state went to men of the noble class. There was very little that can be called democratic in the Anglo-Saxon world. The non-noble freeman, or seorl, lived in the Anglo-Saxon village and usually held about 1 hide of land, or 120 acres. In the later Anglo-Saxon period, many of these seorls fell under the control of local lords and thus lost their economic and personal independence and sank into the unfree classes. The general drift of the mass of the Anglo-Saxons before the Normans came was the freedom towards subordination and servitude, the slimness of the average freeman's resources, the dangers of cattle plague or bad harvests, the Danish invasions, the king's food rents account in part for the fact that many freemen were compelled to put themselves under the protection and at the disposal of lords who could give them food and security. Below the freemen were the serfs and slaves. A serf might not be mistreated or sold. He might marry. He worked for his lord, and he paid the lord in produce from the land he held. Finally, there were the slaves, mere chattels, living tools that might be bought and sold. Village, hundred, and shire. Most Anglo-Saxons lived together in small villages in the midst of rural agricultural areas. There was little Anglo-Saxon commerce, and hence little stimulation towards urban development. There were no major imports or exports, except the small flow brought about by the pilgrimages of some Anglo-Saxons to Rome, the trips of the missionaries, the limited shuttlecock movements of continental traders across the channel seeking slaves, tin, or wool, and bringing in such things as gems, trinkets, silk, and oil. There was some industry, but not on a large scale. Artisans in metal were particularly skilled, but most of the arts and crafts were those practiced by the freemen in their huts. The origin of commercial and industrial towns was essentially a latter Danish and Norman development. Historians, especially the late Professor James Tate and Professor Carl Stevenson, have warmly debated the origin and growth of English boroughs or towns. Such boroughs as there were had really no urban character. Their trade and commerce, their business, was upon a very small scale. In the villages, the basis of Anglo-Saxon social organization, there usually lived from 10 to 30 families, their thatched huts clustered together. Out from the village stretched the fields, where the open field system existed. It was not found in the far north or along the Welsh border. The arable enclosed land was divided into strips, usually separated by unplowed turf. A villager might have several strips scattered in different parts of the great open field. Grain, fruit, and vegetables were grown in the fields. Cattle, sheep, and hogs were pastured together in the untilled grass areas and in the woods. From the forest and the marsh were obtained wood and peat for fuel. There were the local smiths, millers, potters, and carpenters, apart from the necessary imports such as iron, wax, and salt. The Anglo-Saxon village was self-sufficient. Above the village and the borough, the smallest units in Anglo-Saxon England was the hundred, the north of England known by the Danish name Wapentake. The hundred usually contained about 100 hides, or 12,000 acres, in the Midlands. Elsewhere, the size varied considerably. One country contained 61 hundreds, another only 4. The 100 had a court that met every 4 weeks to administer justice and settle local pleas. The king's reeve presided over, but did not control the deliberations of the freemen, who remembered and applied the customary law. The 100 court, attended by all free landholders, was the most active and popular of the local organs of Anglo-Saxon government, a successful financial, judicial, and administrative unit. The largest Anglo-Saxon administrative division in the local government system was known as the shire, later called a county, after the Norman equivalent comte. In each shire was a shire court, a public assembly that met twice a year. This shire court was presided over by the ealdorman, who was always a noble, the head of the shire community, the commander of the militia, a second royal official in the shire was the shire reeve or sheriff. He was the guardian of the king's interests in the shire. He was the effective link between the crown and the local districts. He stood for the royal power, even within a territory of the greatest lords. As the king's financial agent, it was his task to maintain the king's peace in the shire and to collect the royal revenues, such as rents from peace in the shire and that's from the royal estates, and the fines imposed by the courts. The sheriff was often instructed to carry out specific royal orders in the shire. By the side of the ealdorman and the sheriff sat the bishop, who declared ecclesiastical law. These three men were the pillars of government and law in the shires. So I think I'll stop there for now and continue here in another video with King, Wit, and Law. So hopefully I helped you fall asleep a little bit. That was a little bit from England, A Short History by Goldwin Smith. Yeah, so thank you for watching my videos, and liking, commenting, and subscribing.